Benvenuti a tutti! Welcome to another edition of Italian America Long Island. I was just doing some studying about Christopher Columbus. Did you know that there's a movement to discredit Columbus? Some misinformed radicals want to remove his statues, and they also want to erase Columbus Day from the calendar. They have a lot of criticisms about Columbus, some which range from the ridiculous, that he didn't discover America and that he wasn't even Italian, to even more serious claims that he enslaved the native peoples, committed genocide, and was a cruel tyrant. Well, these claims disturbed me so much, I wanted to do some studying on my own. And if you will just take a minute to listen to what I found out, I think you'll gain a much more sympathetic understanding of the true facts surrounding the great Christopher Columbus.
There is one outstanding truth that people of all political points of view agree on. Christopher Columbus opened the Americas to Europe and the rest of the world. Even though anthropologists theorize that ancient people came to this continent thousands of years ago by crossing a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, certainly those primitive natives could not cross the Atlantic in dugout canoes. The great Khans of Asia saw no need to travel across the seas in their junk boats and were happy to stay where they were. Leif Erikson, the Viking who reached the North American continent, kept his American journey secret, and evidence of that trip was not even discovered until recently. Unlike Erikson, who took a safer northerly route, traveling mostly from one known point of land to another, Columbus courageously headed due west of Spain, challenging the vast unknown Atlantic Ocean. Bartolomé de las Casas, one of Columbus's contemporaries, wrote in his book, History of the Indies, "Is there anything on earth comparable to opening the tightly shut doors of an ocean that no one dared enter before? God gave this man the keys to the awesome seas. He and no other unlocked the darkness. To him and no other there is owed for ever and ever all that exists beyond those doors." Hundreds of millions of Americans have ancestry that traces back to Europe or other continents. Our country is a nation of immigrants, and we all owe the fact that we enjoy the freedoms and benefits of modern American life to Christopher Columbus. It was Columbus and only Columbus who joined the hemispheres and created the flow of millions of people to the Americas. This is what is meant by the phrase, Columbus discovered America. Professor Rosaria Iaconis of Suffolk Community College has written, "He enlarged the world, altered the course of human events, and made possible the last best hope of earth, the United States of America." There are only a handful of original books, records, and documents concerning Columbus and his voyages, even though thousands of other works have been written about him. The best of these later materials are basically interpretations of the original materials. And like the children's game of telephone, often that original material has been transformed into something quite different. I encourage everyone to read the original documents for themselves to determine their own informed opinions. Too often, authors interpret the Columbus documents with an intent to rewrite history from their own political point of view. As the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels said, "Repeat a lie often enough, and it becomes the truth." Go to your local library, where you can easily find copies of Columbus's own journals, his son Fernando's biography of him, and two important works by Bartolomé de las Casas, who had accompanied Columbus on his voyages. A short account of the destruction of the Indies, and History of the Indies. This last book describes how Columbus's mission to convert the natives to Christianity descended into atrocities by the later conquistadors, but de las Casas nevertheless maintains great admiration for Columbus. Erroneously and ironically, many critics of Columbus quote the works of de las Casas. De las Casas wrote about Columbus, "He was the most outstanding sailor in the world, versed like no other in the art of navigation, for which divine providence chose him to accomplish the most outstanding feat ever accomplished in the world until now." Much of the anti-Columbus movement stems from the book A People's History of the United States by self-proclaimed radical professor Howard Zinn, first published in 1980. This piece of paperback history has been severely criticized by serious scholars in legitimate journals and prestigious magazines. Rutgers professor Daniel Greenberg, writing in The New Republic, claims that Zinn, quote, declared that historical research should be carried out to serve present-day political ends, and that, quote, Zinn reduced historical analysis to political opinion. Zinn's radical ideas led to his embarrassing dismissal from the world-famous Spelman College. Professors Michael Kazin of Georgetown University and Michael Kamen of Cornell University both condemned Zinn's book as a black-and-white story of elite villains and oppressed victims, a story that robs American history of its depth and intricacy and leaves nothing but an empty text simplified to the level of propaganda. Professor Zinn's one-sided distortion of Columbus's exploits was the source for the blogger Matthew Inman's bitter attack in his piece Columbus Day on his silly comic website called The Oatmeal. Mr. Inman did not cite any of the original sources, and his wildly popular Seattle-based comic blog no doubt influenced many when Seattle replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. What a travesty of justice and shame on the young people of Seattle, that their public policy should be swayed by something as frivolous as a poorly researched comic strip. I think Mr. Inman let Professor Zinn do his thinking for him. So, what are some of the truths about Columbus that his detractors have neglected to consider, either deliberately or through ignorance? In January of 1492, 7 months before Columbus sailed on his historic journey, the Muslim Moors were finally driven from Granada. This major victory for the Christian monarchs of Castile gave tremendous momentum to the desire to spread Christianity throughout the world. After many years of pleading and presenting his case, this is one reason that Ferdinand and Isabella finally supported Columbus at this time. They sought wealth and riches, of course, but the power of that wealth was to be used to further enlarge the Christian domain and save souls of this world. For this reason, his ships bore the sign of the cross on their sails. Columbus was extremely religious, and his sailors said group prayers at regular intervals throughout each sailing day. Columbus thought he was a missionary of sorts. His son Fernando explains in his biography that Columbus's own name had a significant relevance to his discoveries. Christopher means Christ-bearer or carrier in Latin, and Colombo means dove in Italian. Thus, his name signifies the dove who brings Christ, and that is how he thought of his mission. This opinion of Columbus is echoed once again by Las Casas. He believed that Columbus had been chosen by God for his learning and virtue to bring the gospel to the New World. It was for this reason, he wrote, that he was called Christum Ferens, which means carrier or bearer of Christ. According to the original primary sources and documents, What did Columbus think of the Arawak indigenous people that he called Indians? Time after time, on page after page, Columbus's concern for the fair treatment of these peoples is reiterated. On page 94 of his journal, Columbus says, "Soon many of the islanders gathered round us. I could see that they were people who would be more easily converted to our holy faith by love rather than by coercion. I gave orders for them all to be received with honor. They are the finest and gentlest folk in the world, and I trust in God that your majesties will make Christians of them all, and that they will all be your people, which I indeed now hold them to be. Considering the generosity of heart of the Indians, I have given orders that nothing shall be accepted without some payment. There can be no better nor gentler people in all the world than these. I have told my crew to pay great attention and reverence to King Guacanagari, the Arawak Indian chief, that they should indeed make every effort to earn his good will and preserve his love and friendship." But not all who voyaged with Columbus followed his directives. Columbus had difficulty controlling Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, who claimed he was the real discoverer of the New World when the first expedition returned to Spain. On that first journey, Pinzon took the Pinta and left the convoy, seeking gold and taking captives against Columbus's orders. Wrote Columbus, "His wicked behavior is so clear. He took away 4 Indians and 2 girls by force. I have ordered that they be given clothes and taken ashore so that they may go home." Some claim that Columbus was directly or indirectly responsible for the genocide of the indigenous people by bringing disease to the New World. Listen to award-winning author Ethel Dixon on this topic. "It is doubtful Columbus or any of the Europeans deliberately used disease as a weapon against the Indians in the early 1500s. They simply did not have the necessary knowledge to do so. It was not until the mid-1700s that scientists began to understand the nature of immunity. In Columbus's time, Europeans could not possibly have anticipated the Indians' complete lack of immunological defenses. While the countless Indian deaths were of course a tragedy of massive proportions, it was clearly the unintentional result of first contact between the two cultures. Therefore, the word genocide, with its implications of murderous intent, does not accurately apply." Mr. Dixon continues, "Those who insist on calling the Indian deaths genocide must contend with the less widely known fact that the first contact between Europeans and Indians also led directly to a massive pandemic in Europe. Columbus's men contracted syphilis from the Indians, took it home to the European continent, where it did not exist, and as many as 5 million Europeans died. Were those European deaths the genocidal result of Indian ruthlessness? If not, then surely we must stop condemning the Europeans for the same thing." One difficulty in studying history is the tendency to look back on past events and color them with our own current beliefs and emotions. For example, a mere 80 years ago, corporal punishment, that is, physical beating, was an accepted disciplinary tool in most American schools. Many children felt the sting of the paddle or the ruler. Today, modern parents are outraged by a teacher merely raising his or her voice at a misbehaving child. However, back in the 1940s, that was the accepted and expected norm. A principal or teacher who delivered such corporal punishment was not viewed as cruel, but rather often praised as a strict disciplinarian. We should keep this example in mind when we examine the events of Columbus's time. Many of the indigenous tribes engaged in practices that we modern people would consider barbarous. The Carib tribe, for whom the Caribbean islands are named, owned Arawak slaves. This was discovered when Columbus noticed the men spoke a different language than the women. The Caribs had killed the Arawak men and captured their women for themselves. There is also evidence as to the taking of human trophies, such as body parts, and the ritual cannibalism of war captives among both the Carib and other Amerindian groups, such as the Arawak. Over the 2 centuries leading up to Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492, scholars believe the Caribs mostly displaced the Taino tribe by warfare, extermination, and assimilation. There is a statue of the Carib chieftain Caonabo in Santo Domingo. Shouldn't Columbus's critics demand that it also be removed? Because he was a cruel man who exterminated his enemies, enslaved his captives, and ate their flesh? In all the original documents pertaining to Columbus, there is one reference I have found that does disturb me as a 21st century person. Columbus wrote a letter to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, suggesting that the Caribs, like Caonabo, be captured and used as slaves in Spain. However, from the 16th century point of view, this would be a just and logical suggestion, one that even the defeated Caribs themselves would probably accept and expect. By the way, the king and queen decided against enslaving the indigenous peoples. As for the claims that Columbus was a cruel man who inflicted harsh punishments on both the natives and his own men, listen to what Bartolomé de las Casas has to say about an incident that occurred on one of Columbus's voyages. Starving, the only way to survive was to build a mill that would grind the grain that they had brought with them from Spain into flour to make bread. De las Casas says, "The manual workers were too sick and too weak to work. Everyone had to pitch in, hidalgos and courtiers alike, people for whom having to work with their hands was equivalent to death, especially on empty stomachs. As might be expected, the outcome was hatred for Columbus, and this is the source of his reputation in Spain as a cruel man unfit to rule." Remember, Columbus was from Genoa, a fact that was proven in 2004 when the Genoese government displayed the ancient records tracing Columbus's lineage and birth. The Spaniards that made up the majority on his expeditions did not trust him, thinking he would betray Spain and claim the New World for Genoa. They often invented reasons to mutiny against him and his brothers, who ruled the islands while Columbus himself continued his explorations as far as Panama, Nicaragua, and Venezuela on the mainland continent of South America. As Professor Rosario Iaconis of Suffolk Community College suggests, as an Italian sailing for Spain, Columbus was caught in the crossfire among the Spanish crown, its conquistadors, and the indigenous people. After reading many of the original documents, I believe the greed and completely unchecked selfishness of those who traveled with him, especially on his later voyages, led to many of the calamities that occurred. This new world was completely wild, without law, rules, and societal norms that will normally keep in check the greed and base desires of men far from home. On subsequent voyages, Columbus devoted most of his time in the New World to discovery, sailing as much as he could while he left his brothers behind to administer the new settlements and forts. His brothers, however, could not control men such as Hojeda and Roldan, Spaniards who resented the pious Italians and plotted against them. They rebelled against the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that Bartholomew Columbus, whom Christopher had named governor, required. According to Fernando Columbus, the rebels demanded, quote, that they should be allowed to use the Indians as they pleased. Some of the rebels had multiple Indian wives, something strictly forbidden in Spain. In such a wild and untamed world, they rebelled at these pious, and I might add, unrealistic demands. Columbus could not control the people he had brought to the New World. Their greed and desires were just too strong. This resulted in atrocities that are unfairly attributed to Columbus. Columbus excelled as a sailor and navigator, not a government administrator. He was not capable of being the tyrant some have made him out to be. Hence the well-documented number of mutinies and rebellions he experienced. Columbus critics mock him for thinking he had found India, and they claim the people of his time already knew that the world was a sphere. Educated people knew that. Those like Columbus, who were familiar with the works of the ancient Egyptian Ptolemy and had seen globes made by Martin Behaim, which showed the world as Columbus believed it to be. However, the average sailor was terrified of the open ocean. In his journal, Columbus had to calm the fears of his crew the minute they lost sight of land. The sailors also believed that the waters of the ocean ran downhill, like a river, away from land, so that it would be impossible to return. Over the years, this belief was twisted into the notion that they could drop off the edge of the earth. Again, this brings to mind the children's game of telephone. Even today, how many people would cross the open ocean in a ship the size of the Santa Maria? Columbus bravely risked his life for his belief. Some claim that Columbus was ignorant. Quite the contrary. He had attended Pavia University near Milan and was well versed in mathematics, astronomy, navigation, Latin, Spanish, French, and Genoese Italian. He studied many ancient manuscripts and had much real experience as a sailor, having first gone to sea when he was 14. He brought his theories to the courts of many of Europe's kingdoms. That they even listened to him is testimony to his scholarship and their regard for his learning and expertise. Hindsight has 20/20 vision, but in Columbus's time, the known world stretched from Europe in the west to Cathay, which we call China, and the legendary Chipango, or Japan, to the east. People of his time had no way of knowing there was an entire continent separating the two. No satellites, no GPS, not even maps. It is totally understandable that Columbus thought he was in India. In fact, if there weren't a new world in between these two places, he would have ended up there.
Today, 525 years after his historic first voyage, in a world filled with fake news, where anyone can post any lie or half-truth they want on the internet and share it instantaneously with millions of people, how are we to know what the truth is? My answer? Go to the library and get the original books and documents for yourself. Don't rely on any other professors. Look at them yourself and make your own informed opinions. I read many of these books, and my conclusion is that Columbus is truly worthy of the admiration that millions of people over hundreds of generations have given him. His qualities of persistence, courage, high level of expertise in his chosen field, his religious devotion, these are all qualities that modern people can emulate. Finally, as a nation of immigrants, every American owes something to Columbus, not just the Italian-American community, who is so proud of him. It's a terrible injustice to the very truth itself that some people have tried to discredit him and want to have his statues and his day removed from the calendar. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something from this video, and I hope you share it with your friends. Ci vediamo.